The soft evening breeze drifted through the open window, brushing against Alyssa's skin as she sat by her bed, staring out at a world that was moving on without her. From the time she was a little girl, she dreamed of falling in love, not the shallow, fleeting kind, but the love that made her feel safe, cherished, and wanted. She wanted a family, a husband who would hold her close after a long day, and children she would tuck into bed every night. She wanted to travel with them, cook for them, and build a life wrapped in warmth and laughter. But life had stolen that dream. At 24, Alyssa had been handed the cruelest fate: stage 4 cancer, aggressive and unforgiving. The doctors had given her only 5 days to live. Her body had become her greatest enemy. Her skin had lost its color. Her once beautiful hair barely clung to her scalp, and the constant bleeding made her smell of iron no matter how much perfume she wore. Her mother, her only family since her father passed, had sacrificed everything for her. Her father's precious belongings, her mother's jewelry, even the memories they once held dear, all sold in hopes of a miracle that never came. All Alyssa had left was a single luxury dress her father had bought her years ago, still neatly folded in her closet. That night, Alyssa whispered her final wish to her mother. "Please, I want to wear my dress. Take me to that beautiful restaurant just once more. I want to sit there, look beautiful, and feel like a normal girl, even if it's just for one night." Her mother's heart shattered all over again, but she nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay, my love. We'll go." That evening, Alyssa stood in front of the mirror, the elegant dress draping over her fragile frame. It hung looser than it used to, her thin body unable to fill it the way it once did, but to her, it was perfect. The reflection staring back at her didn't hide the paleness of her skin or the dark shadows beneath her eyes, but for the first time in a long while, she saw her again, not just the sickness. "Beautiful," her mother whispered, tears clinging to her lashes. Hand in hand, they made their way to the upscale restaurant, a place Alyssa had once dreamed of going to with her future husband. Tonight, she would sit at one of those tables, even if her life had taken a different path. At that same restaurant, Nathaniel Blackwell, the billionaire CEO whose name alone could silence rooms, arrived with his glamorous fiancée on his arm. Wealth, power, and influence followed him everywhere he went, and everyone knew him as a man who took what he wanted and kept it. As they entered, Nathaniel's fiancée excused herself, stepping aside to answer a call. He didn't think much of it until he caught the way her voice softened, her smile playful in a way it hadn't been with him in months. His jaw tightened, the weight of betrayal curling in his chest like fire. If she wanted to disrespect him, he would show her what disrespect felt like. That's when his gaze drifted across the room, landing on Alyssa, sitting alone by the window, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the hem of her dress. There was something about her, fragile, yet strong in a way most people overlooked. She was nothing like the polished women who usually circled his world, but something about her felt real. Without a second thought, Nathaniel crossed the room and slid into the seat across from her. Alyssa's eyes widened, startled by the man now sitting at her table. Tall, powerful, his tailored suit a clear sign he belonged to a world she'd never know. "What's a girl like you doing here all alone?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, the kind of tone that usually made people tread carefully. Alyssa swallowed, her voice soft. I just wanted to feel normal for a night." Something about her honesty tugged at him. "Normal, huh? And what does normal look like to you?" She glanced down at her hands. "Being loved, having a family, someone to hold me and tell me everything will be okay." It was such a simple wish, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. In his world, love was a transaction. Appearances, power, status, no one ever asked for the simple things. Before he could respond, the sharp click of heels shattered the moment. "So, this is why you walked away from our table?" Nathaniel's fiancée stood over them, her eyes blazing with jealousy and rage. "You're sitting here with this thing?" She sneered, her gaze scanning Alyssa's fragile frame with open disgust. "Seriously, Nathaniel? What even is this?" "Watch your mouth," Nathaniel warned, his voice low and dangerous. But the fiancée wasn't done. Her frustration boiled over, and with a careless flick of her arm, her heavy designer bag swung forward, striking Alyssa's side. Alyssa, already weak, lost her balance. Her body crumpled to the floor, her frail form hitting the cold marble with a soft, heart-wrenching sound. "Oh, please," the fiancée scoffed, rolling her eyes. "It was just a mistake. She's probably been looking for attention all night." The entire restaurant went silent. Alyssa's mother rushed in, her heart stopping at the sight of her daughter on the floor. "Alyssa!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside her. Nathaniel moved faster than anyone, kneeling beside Alyssa before her mother could even touch her. Without hesitation, he scooped Alyssa into his arms, her head resting against his chest. "She needs a hospital," her mother's voice shook with panic. "I'll take her," Nathaniel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. His fiancée opened her mouth to protest, but the look in Nathaniel's eyes, cold, furious, protective, froze her in place. Without another word, he carried Alyssa out into the night, her blood staining his crisp white shirt. In that moment, the man who controlled empires and crushed competitors realized there was one thing he couldn't control: the fragile girl in his arms. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Blackwell was afraid. The hospital doors flew open, the sharp echo of footsteps filling the sterile hallway, as Nathaniel Blackwell, a man feared in boardrooms and envied at exclusive tables, carried Alyssa's fragile body in his arms. The fabric of her beautiful dress, once a symbol of her final wish, was now stained with blood. Her head rested weakly against his chest, her breath faint and shallow. The moment her mother saw her daughter limp and bleeding in the arms of a stranger, her world shattered. "You monster!" Her mother's voice cracked, trembling with grief and rage. "What did you do to my daughter? You wanted to humiliate her, and now you've killed her!" Nathaniel didn't flinch under the accusation, though the words pierced deeper than any corporate betrayal he had ever faced. "No, I didn't. I swear I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice stripped of all power, leaving only raw, unfamiliar vulnerability. Her mother stepped closer, jabbing her finger into his chest, her tears falling freely. "She's all I have left. Do you even know what you've done? She has 5 days left to live. 5. And you thought it was funny to torment her? To ruin her one moment of happiness?" Nathaniel staggered back, her words landing like a punch to his chest. His breath caught in his throat. 5 days. Just 5 days. I didn't know," he said, barely above a whisper. "Please, let me see her." Her mother shook her head, fury mixing with anguish. "I don't want you anywhere near her. You're the last face she should see after what you did. Leave. Go back to your cold world and leave my daughter in peace." "I'm begging you," Nathaniel's voice cracked, the weight of helplessness pulling at every word. "I'll do anything. I need to—" "No!" Her mother's scream cut him off, her body trembling with the weight of her breaking heart. "I don't care who you are. You're not stepping foot in her room. Get out!" Security moved closer, their silent presence warning him that her word was final. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Blackwell had no power. No amount of money could open that door. No influence could fix the damage he'd done. With his head bowed and his fists clenched, he stepped back, turning toward the exit. The cold night air hit his face as he sank onto the bench just outside the hospital entrance. The billionaire who controlled entire industries sat alone, elbows on his knees, staring blankly at the cracked pavement beneath his feet. In his mind, all he could see was Alyssa. The way her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass at the restaurant, the shy smile she gave him, the quiet longing in her eyes. He barely knew her, yet the thought of her life slipping away felt unbearable. For once, Nathaniel didn't want to own something. He wanted to deserve it. Inside the hospital room, Alyssa lay propped up against her pillows, her mother brushing her damp hair back from her face. "I'm so sorry, my love," her mother whispered. "I shouldn't have let you go to that place." "No, Mom." Alyssa's voice was weak but firm. "I'm glad we went. I wanted to feel beautiful, even just for a little while." Her mother's eyes filled again, her fingers trembling as they ran through Alyssa's thinning hair. "But after what he did..." Alyssa's smile was faint, but there was no bitterness in it. "He didn't know. He looked at me like I was someone worth seeing, not just a dying girl. I felt normal." Her mother opened her mouth to protest, but a soft knock interrupted. The door opened just enough for Nathaniel to step inside, his usual commanding presence replaced with hesitation. In his hand, slightly crushed from his grip, was a bouquet of soft pink roses, delicate and trembling, just like the girl in the bed. Her mother's face hardened instantly, her protective instincts flaring. "You've got some nerve showing up here." But before her anger could fully ignite, Alyssa's frail hand gently touched her mother's wrist. "Please, let me talk to him." The ache in her voice was too much to fight. With visible reluctance, her mother stepped back, though her protective gaze never left Nathaniel. Nathaniel approached slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the moment. He placed the flowers gently on the bedside table, clearing his throat. "I didn't know what your favorite flowers were," he said softly. "I just thought these were beautiful. Like you." Alyssa's fingers grazed the petals, her smile soft and trembling. "They're perfect." Nathaniel knelt beside her bed, his hands resting on the edge, just close enough to hers, but not touching, afraid his touch might be too much for her fragile frame. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know, but I know now." Alyssa's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Why did you come back?" Nathaniel's throat tightened, his jaw clenching briefly before he spoke. "Because walking away felt wrong. I've spent my whole life chasing things, power, control, money, but none of it felt like this." Her breath hitched slightly. "Like what?" His hand finally reached hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, gentle, hesitant, but desperate to anchor himself to her somehow. "Like something I can't lose," he said softly. "Something I'm afraid to lose." Her mother, standing by the door, watched the scene unfold with her heart in her throat. Everything in her wanted to scream at him to leave, to protect her daughter from false hope, from pain. But there was something in his voice, something broken and real, that silenced her. "I don't have much time," Alyssa whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of reality. Nathaniel's grip on her hand tightened just a fraction. "Then let me spend what's left with you. Let me give you something beautiful, even if it's only for a few days." Her tears slipped down her pale cheeks, but her smile stayed. "Okay." Nathaniel lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her fragile skin. A vow, a promise, a plea. And for the first time in her life, Alyssa didn't feel like the sick girl waiting to die. She felt seen, wanted, loved. Morning sunlight poured through the hospital window, casting soft golden streaks across the white sheets of Alyssa's bed. Her frail body still carried the weight of exhaustion, but today, something was different. Today, she was going home. Nathaniel stood by the doorway, watching as the nurses carefully removed the IV from her arm. He had barely left the hospital since that night, his presence becoming an unspoken shadow in her world. You ready? He asked, his deep voice softer than usual. Alyssa gave him a tired smile. As ready as I'll ever be. Her mother stood beside her, adjusting the scarf around her neck. We should go. The doctor said she needs rest, and I don't want her getting too tired. Nathaniel, without hesitation, reached down and gently scooped Alyssa into his arms before she could protest. Hey, I can walk, she exclaimed, her weak laughter filling the room. Nathaniel smirked. And I don't care. Let me do this. Alyssa sighed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she rested her head against his chest, the steady beat of his heart grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. As he carried her through the hospital doors, her mother walked ahead, flagging down a cab. Nathaniel, however, shook his head. My driver's waiting. I'm taking you home. Her mother frowned. You don't have to. I want to, Nathaniel interrupted, his gaze locked onto hers with a quiet certainty. Let me do this for her. Alyssa's mother hesitated before nodding, her lips pressing into a thin line. Fine, but I don't trust you. Nathaniel chuckled. That makes two of us. When they arrived at her house, Nathaniel parked outside, his gaze sweeping over the small, cozy home. It was nothing like the mansions and penthouses he was used to. It was warm, lived in, filled with memories and love. Her mother stepped out of the car first, opening the front door and disappearing inside to prepare tea. But Nathaniel didn't move. Neither did Alyssa. She turned to him, studying his strong profile as he stared out the windshield, lost in thought. You don't have to stay, she said softly. Nathaniel exhaled slowly before turning his head to look at her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those piercing, intense eyes, held something new, something unfamiliar, even to him. I know, he said, but I want to. Alyssa bit her lip, searching his face. Why? Nathaniel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You keep asking me that, like you don't believe I'd be here. She tilted her head slightly. Because it doesn't make sense. His smirk faltered, and for a moment, silence filled the space between them. Then, his voice dropped to something softer. Something real. I don't know how to explain it, he admitted. But ever since I met you, I can't... He stopped himself, raking a hand through his hair in frustration. I don't walk away from things. I control them. I fix them. But I can't fix this, Alyssa. And it's killing me. Alyssa's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the fabric of his coat. Maybe I don't need you to fix it, she whispered. Nathaniel turned to her, his jaw clenching slightly. Then what do you need? She swallowed hard. For once in my life, I just want to feel something other than sick. I want to laugh without worrying about how many breaths I have left. I want to feel safe, even if it's just for a little while. Nathaniel's gaze darkened with something unreadable. Then, in a move so gentle it startled her, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Then let me do that, he murmured. Alyssa let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. You're impossible, Nathaniel smirked. You have no idea. She sighed, leaning back in her seat. Okay then. If you really want to do something for me, let's go inside. I want to talk before I fall asleep. Nathaniel nodded, stepping out of the car before helping her inside. The living room was warm, the soft scent of lavender filling the air as Alyssa curled up on the couch, sipping tea while Nathaniel sat beside her, watching her like she was the most fragile thing in the world. You can stop looking at me like I'm going to break, she teased. Nathaniel smirked, leaning back against the couch. I'm just trying to figure you, because if I don't believe in love, then what was the point of all of this? She whispered. I never got to experience it. I never got to be in love, to have someone look at me like I was their whole world. And I want to believe that, somewhere, somehow, that kind of love exists, even if I never get to have it. Nathaniel's throat tightened, something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. You've never been in a relationship before? He asked quietly. Alyssa shook her head, a small smile on her lips. Nope. I was always waiting for the right person. And then, before I knew it, I was sick. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. That's not fair, Alyssa chuckled. Life isn't fair, Nathaniel. Silence filled the space between them before she suddenly grinned, setting her mug aside and reaching into her small bag. Okay, you want to know something real about me? She asked playfully. Nathaniel smirked. I think I already do. She rolled her eyes and pulled out a worn-out notebook, flipping it open before handing it to him. Here, read this. Nathaniel took it, his eyes scanning the words written in slightly faded ink. Alyssa's bucket list 1. Fall in love. 2. Kiss her Prince Charming. 3. Go to the cinema. 5. Eat ice cream at midnight. 5. Ride a Ferris wheel. 6. Dance in the rain. 7. Walk barefoot on the beach at sunrise. 8. See the stars from the top of a hill. 9. Slow dance with someone special. Nathaniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You really went all in on the romance, huh? Alyssa grinned. What can I say? I've always been a dreamer. His expression softened as he stared at the list. Then, without hesitation, he met her gaze. Let's do it, he said. Alyssa blinked. What? Nathaniel smirked. Let's start checking things off. You want to help me with my bucket list? Why not? He leaned back, arms crossed. We've got 5 days, right? Let's make them count. Alyssa bit her lip, her heart fluttering. All right, she whispered. Let's do it. Nathaniel grinned. What's first? Alyssa glanced down at the page, then smiled. The cinema. Nathaniel grabbed his keys. Done. Let's go. Her mother stepped in, arms crossed. I still don't trust you, Nathaniel. But if you take her anywhere, you better watch over her. Nathaniel met her gaze with quiet confidence. I will. Hours later, the neon glow of the movie theater flickered against the night sky. Alyssa clutched her popcorn, her face lit up with excitement. You really did this just because of a silly bucket list, she murmured. Nathaniel stepped closer, his fingers grazing her cheek. It's not silly if it makes you happy. Alyssa swallowed hard. Number 2, she whispered. Nathaniel's gaze flickered to her lips. Are you sure? She nodded. And as the cool night air wrapped around them, Nathaniel Blackwell kissed her. Not out of pity, not out of guilt, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted to. To be continued.